If you like clicky switches, why not? Blue Alps, white Alps, it's going to be a fun time. Well, this is my OmniKey 101. Thank you everyone so much for watching and checking this out with me. I'll catch you in the next video. And don't forget, keep on keyboarding. Pew, 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 pew. Well, time to get editing. But what am I going to edit on? This is my ASK55. And today we're going to be starting the adventure of using this keyboard for a week. So let's get to it.
3 weeks later.
Hi, I'm Man of Interest and I'd like to talk about the ASK55. When I first started writing this review, I kept trying to make this analogy comparing the ASK55 to a classic car, but as I kept writing and editing this video, I could never make that comparison stick as well as I wanted. Then I realized what it was. The ASK55 isn't a classic car, just like how it isn't a vintage keyboard. The ASK55 is a kit car modeled after a classic car. It's a keyboard modeled after a vintage board that never existed. Before we get to the ASK55, let's talk about the keyboard that got us here. Those with an eye for vintage boards may have already realized that the ASK55 is a custom Alps board using the layout from the Apple standard keyboard, specifically the M0116. The M0116 came in both salmon and orange Alps flavors. The ASK55 we're talking about today takes the 60% typing cluster of the M0116 and puts it in its own plastic chassis. The Apple standard keyboard line ran from 1987 to 1990 and included the M0116, M0118, and M0117AB. In 1987, the M0116 cost $129, which is roughly $305 in today money. I purchased my M0116 for $50 and this kit for $240, putting the build excluding labor at $290, which is below the original M0116 price, and I'm happy with that because that includes switches, stabilizers, keycaps. My M0116 was made with salmon Alps, so salmon Alps are here. Salmon Alps are basically a third-tier tactile behind brown and orange Alps, and in my opinion, they are a third-tier tactile behind brown and orange Alps. Maybe I'll learn how to melt tea candle wax in the future to try to fix them up, but I don't think my channel is controversial enough to melt wax just yet. Maybe next video. Like with kit cars, the ASK55 requires some assembly, chiefly some disassembly, since you'll need to salvage the keycaps and stabilizers from an M0116. And sure, you could choose to get your Alps switches from wherever you want, but in this case, I'd rather save a buck and use the switches from the M0116. Plus, it's more authentic. Arguably, you could, like I said, use Matthias switches for cheapness and blank Alps keycaps if you don't mind weird incomplete spacing and subpar switches, but that's a general misunderstanding of the ASK55. And if you're going to do that, you're probably not the person who'd care to buy an ASK55 anyways. But hey, once everything is gathered together, it's an extremely simple process of just soldering the switches on the PCB and plate and screwing everything together. A very simple build. So, like with kit cars, the looks are super important. So let's take a look at the keyboard from the outside. Geometry is simple and feels period correct, so to speak. The bezels are decently sized and make for a nice aesthetic. The keycaps look hidden when you're looking at the keyboard head on from the back, and I like how the profile of the keycaps look with a gentle curve when viewing the keyboard from the side. It's not all glitz and glamour though. For example, the USB-C port cutout is lazy. It's just a big old rectangular cutout. Nothing graceful about that. But it is functional. The geometry and bezels try hard to avoid sharp edges and it feels fine to handle because of that. The case itself is plastic with a matte texture. I described the color as like bone or pre-yellowed. I guess since most people who are going to find an M0116 to use probably aren't going to find keycaps in the best of condition, maybe somewhat yellowed keycaps, as opposed to new in box coloring, it looks pretty good with this board. Like my keycaps are definitely not in the best of condition, but they look like they belong with this case. The texture of the case feels pretty nice to touch, but if you look closely, it doesn't look nice to touch. The surface picks up every little scratch and mark ever so subtly. I can slide my nail across with minimal force and you'll see a mark. It'll definitely need to have the right mindset to have a board like this, but hey, all those little marks will definitely add some character to it. So, how about the keycaps and layout since they're tied together? As you may have guessed, due to the contrast between the spacebar and everything else, the spacebar is ABS while the rest of the keycaps are PBT, die-subbed PBT. The profile is fine, and what will probably throw people off the most is Apple originally going with D and K for their homing keys instead of F and J that we're used to. If you're wondering why this is, Apple has actually officially answered this by saying there was no standard at the time, so we did what we wanted. The layout isn't unusable, and it does have its pros and cons, but they're fine. They're fine. The capstock control switch, capstock and control are swapped, which is always welcome at 60%. Although the capstock, in my opinion, has issues, and that's probably totally rectifiable, but it's an issue many in my position would come across. The locking Alps switch. Some older Alps keyboards, such as the M0116, used a locking Alps switch for the caps lock. So when you press the switch, it'll say mechanically locked until you press it again to release it from that locking mechanism. That's awesome, it sounds cool, and of course, if that's the way it was on my M0116, why shouldn't I want to replicate that on my ASK55? Well, modernity. Well, that's why. And I don't know if I have a problem with my switch, or it's just a Huey is dumb at QMK thing, but the switch does actuate before it's actually locked, which means if you just brush it a little too hard, you won't lock it, but you will activate caps, but you can't unactivate it unless you lock it and unlock it, and that's a pain in the butt. The backspace key, smaller than most 2U spacebars we're used to, but the shorter backspace and even the L-shaped return key, not a big deal. Arrows, sensibly placed, but you love them or you hate them like this. The spacebar is small, but it needs to be where it is, and it always is there for you for the average person. Stabilizers. They've always been a weakness for Alps in my personal opinion. They're never completely horrible, but they're never super amazing. Most of the stabilizers don't have a large amount of rattling on this plate with these keycaps, and most of the louder clacks at least sound crisp. The spacebar and hitting certain parts of the return key have never felt right, with some occasionally featuring some unwanted resistance to the press depending on where you're pressing down. The typing experience for the ASK55 is fine. My salmon switches are mounted into a plastic plate that itself is sandwiched between the top and bottom cases. It's a simple, no frills construction, and it gets the job done. It's not horrible, it's not super amazing, but it's nifty. Using the keyboard day to day has been fine. I've used this on and off for a couple months, and honestly, the only thing I'd change is adding some lube. I'm still debating if I should go for wet lubing Alps like I'm used to, or trying this new T-candle wax method that has been popularized lately. Using this day in, day out, I honestly have no issues with it as a whole keyboard. Sure, it can definitely be improved on, but it's not bad. Honestly, I like keyboards like the ASK55 that ask you to take an older keyboard and make something new out of it. Honestly, I'd never care to actually use an M0116 because I'm not the biggest fan of that keyboard. But tell me I can turn that board into something like the ASK55, now that's an intriguing concept to me. And of course, the ASK55 wasn't super publicly available, and honestly, a lot of vintage people are torn between, new people entering the vintage space to compete with a consistently dwindling supply of vintage boards, and for people already building vintage boards, something like the Alps 55, I think it's pretty awesome. If you ask me, it's a fun keyboard, and while it's not perfect, it has space to improve, and that's what I like about it. Would I recommend this? I mean, if you can get it, and you like Alps, and you know what you're doing, yeah. Thanks so much for watching my review on the ASK55. I hope you consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and don't forget, keep on keyboarding.